What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so I've been sitting here for like the last, 15 minutes maybe? I'm talking to the people on Periscope. I love talking to my fans on Periscope. For those of you guys who don't know, you can find me on Twitter at Comics Explained, and whenever I go live on Periscope, it automatically tweets out. So Periscope, of course, is a live streaming app that most people know about by now, but I talk to my fans all the time, and I hit everybody up, and I was like, guys, I'm running out of ideas. Like, I'm not sure what I should talk about, and fans were just feeding me ideas. Remember the Rob Corps were feeding me ideas, and they were like, just talk about whether or not the old cartoon shows hold up. And so we are. We're gonna be talking about X-Men the Animated Series. And we're not gonna approach this from an academic standpoint, right? Like we're not gonna take the Clean Prince Gaming approach, which if you guys don't know who that is, you guys need to go check out Clean Prince Gaming. That guy, it's amazing. Dude, I love that guy's videos. They're really, really well produced. But we're not gonna do this from an academic standpoint. This is literally gonna be what amounts to an op-ed piece. The personal opinion of me, Rob, on whether or not X-Men the Animated Series was as great as we remember it being. Now, I'm gonna preface this by saying I am biased as hell, and I regret nothing. I love X-Men the Animated Series. I grew up on that show. I love that show so much. That was my introduction to Marvel Comics. So Little Comics Explained, I could have been more than like 7 years old. So this show hits TV screens. And my dad grew up reading comic books. Funnily enough, where I started my channel off as as Marvel Explained, my dad grew up reading DC. Oh, he loved DC. He loved Green Lantern. Of all the people, he loved Green Lantern. But X-Men the Animated Series hits the market. I don't think we caught it when it first came out. I think that we saw it after it was already out. But it was a bonding experience for myself and my dad because he got to sort of rekindle this interest in comic books that he'd long since lost. I mean, he went to the Navy, different things like that. And I was learning about them for the very first time. And that set the stage for me, developing an interest in characters that weren't really in X-Men the Animated Series, but were part of the Marvel Universe, like Captain America, different things like that. It was huge. But looking back, I mean, maybe it is because I'm a little bit biased here, but that show is every bit as awesome as I remember it being, and I could fire it up on Hulu right now, and I could go back and watch. I remember watching those episodes about 6 months ago. Now, there are key episodes that stand out to me more than others, but overall, I could watch the show from start to finish until you get to season 5 when it becomes trash. But I could go from seasons 1 through 4 and literally enjoy every minute. Matter of fact, as soon as I get done recording this, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. But I could go and just enjoy every single one of them. Because when it came to the X-Men the Animated Series, it wasn't just an archetypical superhero comic book show that was nonsensical, right? It wasn't Super Friends. Super Friends was nonsense in a lot of ways. I mean, after all, it was because of Super Friends, everybody walked away with the ideology that Aquaman talks to fish and rides seahorses around the ocean. With the X-Men the Animated Series, there was a lot of depth there. There was a lot of complexity there. The characters had character. They had emotion. It wasn't just Professor X and Wolverine and Cyclops and those guys just running around and there's the enemy and we have to fight them. You had that because, that's what you do when you have a show. But they clearly developed the love triangle between Cyclops, Wolverine, and Jean Grey. There was the grudging respect between Cyclops and Wolverine. There were these great things that focused so much on the characters. The villains themselves. Magneto. Dude, I loved Magneto in X-Men the Animated Series because they took the whole concept from the comics that Magneto was hell-bent on the fact that he was right and everybody else was wrong. That was a stance. Like you watch X-Men the Animated Series, you look at Magneto. Magneto was a guy who in the comics grew up in World War II, watched the concentration camps unfold, watch how, his Jewish people were treated, by the Germans and how so many individuals were disenfranchised of their rights, they were slaughtered, different things like that. And when his mutant powers developed, the argument was, I'm never going to let that happen to mutant kind. And while that is an extreme perception, it is a relatable perception because it takes this idea that there are people who feel helpless in different points in their lives. And then it suddenly says, but what if you had the ability to not be helpless? And that was the whole idea behind it because it was one of those things where Magneto would stand staunchly in the face of the X-Men and everybody in existence and say, I'm right, you're wrong, and that's just the way it is. But at the same time, there were also these tense moments. You'd watch the show and it would be like, so why don't the X-Men just kill all the humans? If humans are such a hassle and all they want to do is tear the X-Men down, then why don't they just kill them all and just be like, you know what, humans, we're kind of tired of your pardon my language, so you're all gonna die. And then we're gonna come back and then we'll just kind of rule the earth and then we'll kill any baseline humans we can find. It was different things like that, but it was as much political as it was superhero, action because the X-Men have historically always been this Marvel Comics allegory for oppressed groups in society. People will say as African Americans, not always. The X-Men represent a multifaceted group. Basically anyone who's ever been oppressed oppressed by any other class is represented in the concept of the X-Men, whether you're a person of Asian descent, a person of, Latin American descent, but it's that whole idea of oppression that's kind of signified in the X-Men stories. And you even saw that. I mean, basically you had the Friends of Humanity, and the Friends of Humanity were the Marvel Comics and the TV show equivalent of the Klan. One of the things they didn't have was William Stryker, the religious fundamentalist who believed it was his mission from God to kill mutants. That was a really, really cool concept from the comics. God Loves, Man Kills is really the only part that it matters, really the only story he was ever in that William Stryker was in that ever mattered, but it was a groundbreaking story. Oh, it's huge. When God Loves, Man Kills came out, you go and look at any of the letters pages, you go look at any of the reviews online, forum posts, the whole 9 yards. You look at any list, look up like the top 20 stories that defined the X-Men, and God Loves, Man Kills will most likely be among that list. And if it's not, then the person who made it doesn't know what they're talking about, because I like this story. But the fact remains here, it's one of those interesting things. It really fits in with the nature of the idea that the X-Men are constantly struggling against an oppressive force that would rather see them eliminated than work with them. And taking that concept and rolling it over into the TV show allowed for all these great political and social engagements and topics of discussion and different things like that. And then there's the idea of just hopelessness, fighting against an enemy that cannot be defeated, namely Apocalypse. Now let me tell y'all something, dude, Apocalypse from X-Men the Animated Series. There will never be a better depiction of Apocalypse than from X-Men the Animated Series. Dude, the guy's one-liners, oh man, let me tell you, whenever I was watching an episode of X-Men the Animated Series and Apocalypse showed up, I was like, oh snap, son, dude, it's about to get real, son, because he'd have these amazing quips. There's two great moments from the history of Apocalypse in X-Men the Animated Series. The first one is Time Fugitives. It was where Cable had to travel back to the present day in order to help Apocalypse develop and release the Legacy virus. It was something along those lines, but basically the way it turned out is that the Legacy virus was initially released and then it devastated the whole of humanity. Bishop went back in time, did something, and it changed Cable's future. And so Cable had to go back in time, stop Bishop, and then expose Wolverine to the Legacy virus so that the Legacy virus would encounter his healing factor and then a cure could be synthesized. But there's this amazing battle where they're fighting off against Apocalypse, and God, what is it he says? Oh, he says, I am the rocks on the eternal shore. Crash against me and be broken. Dude, it was so bad. He's like, I am the rocks on the eternal shore. Crash against me and be broken. And it was like in the heat of the battle, it was like, dude, this guy's wrecking the X-Men and he's still got time for quips. There's this point where it's like all the X-Men are like blasting Apocalypse with everything they have. Wolverine's like, and he's attacking him with his claws, and like Bishop's shooting his laser beams from his guns, and like Cable's doing what he can, and Cyclops is shooting his optic blast, and like Rogue's throwing stuff at him, and Storm's using lightning bolts, and nothing works. And Apocalypse just looks at him, and what does he say? He says, I cannot be harmed. I cannot be defeated. Watch me and tremble, for I bring the purity of oblivion to your world. Dude, I was like, that's the most boss thing I've ever heard. Dude, if I'm fighting against a guy and what I'm doing, and I've got superpowers, and what I'm doing does nothing, and the guy just starts busting out quips like that, I'm like, all right, peace, like I'm out. Because continuing to fight this guy means almost certain doom. And it's kind of cool because before Cable went back into the past, in the original conflict between the X-Men and Apocalypse grew to like 2,000 feet tall and then just incinerated him. He was just like X-Men and then totally obliterated him. And that was the end of the X-Men. They were just totally incinerated by Apocalypse, which was a great little moment because it showed you the reality of what it meant if they faced off against him. If Apocalypse was hell-bent on killing the X-Men, done. That's it. There's nothing more to it than that. They're just out of the picture. That's all there is. But then there's this second encounter where Cable runs into Apocalypse in his own future, in his own timeline, because Apocalypse is immortal, basically. And Cable breaks into his tomb. It's a story called Beyond Good and Evil. It's a 4-part episode, which is really cool, where Apocalypse captures all the most powerful mutants on Earth, basically. And like Cable shows up in Apocalypse's temple, breaks in there, and then triggers a trap. And Apocalypse is just like, feeble mutant, and it's hilarious. It's one of the funniest things ever. Feeble mutant, you dare challenge Apocalypse again? Because like they're facing off time and time again, and so he's like, blasphemer, you shall pay for your hubris. And it's just like, dude. This guy's lines are so amazing. It's dude, oh no, There's a point where Archangel, where Warren Worthington, after he's transformed into Archangel by Apocalypse, the episode's called Obsession. And what ends up happening is Archangel is obsessed with the idea of finding a weakness in Apocalypse. And he ends up like hiring all these different people who are studying like all these different hieroglyphics and, you know, historical texts from Egypt about like what people believe Apocalypse to be and how a lot of people thought he was a god, and like Warren Worthington's freaking out because he's like, he's not indestructible. And then you end up finding out later on in the episode, one of the archaeologists was actually Apocalypse in disguise. He'd shapeshifted into the form of one of the archaeologists and had been tricking Warren Worthington the whole time. But when Warren Worthington takes what he believes to be the weakness of Apocalypse and tries to use it in a battle, Apocalypse is, dude, he starts talking trash the whole time. He was like, return to me, sweet horseman death, and all shall be forgiven. Dude, the guy who voiced him was so cool. And then there's other stuff, dude, like oh my God, One Man's Worth. Okay, so One Man's Worth was this amazing, it was a 2-part episode, and it was an amazing episode that was a continuation of a previous episode where Bishop traveled back in time for the first time. Anyway, the way this played out is it initially picked up with this massive battle between like mutants and humans. And dude, it was so cool because you had like Ant-Man in there. Either it was Ant-Man or it was Giant Man. But they grabbed the technology of Pym particles to like increase people in size. And it was like just all these different armies of these normal humans with superpowers, different things like that. But it was one of these things where like cities were obliterated, you know, and it was like, dude, this is a really, really bleak future. But you saw villains like Mr. Sinister teaming up with what passed for the X-Men, basically this giant unified front of mutants trying to fend off against humans. And come to find out, what had happened was that one of the enemies of Bishop, a guy named Trevor Fitzroy, had traveled into the past at the request of Master Mold, who was basically this massive sentinel that created smaller sentinels and then eventually became sentient and took over the world. But because of this, Trevor Fitzroy travels into the past and then kills Charles Xavier while he's in college. And so because Xavier never formed the X-Men, they weren't there for some key moment or some key event. Either that or there was no one to try to stem the tide of anti-mutant sentiment. And so he ended up just having it all come to a head. And there was this massive civil war that broke out planet-wide between mutants and humans. And so Bishop travels to what's supposed to be his future, only to find out that everything's gone crazy. Magneto's leading this group. Oh, they had Mimic. They had Mimic in that episode. A lot of people don't know who he is. Mimic was a guy who had the ability to copy the powers of others with any level, like with absolute accuracy, and could do it any number of times and could copy more than one power. So like the most iconic image of Mimic is when he's got the optic visor of Cyclops. He has the physical structure of Beast before he became all blue and furry. He's got the wings of Angel and something else. I can't remember what the other one is. But the result is that he was there too. Like he was fighting among, you know, these various forces and so on and so forth. Anyway, Bishop ends up going back in time and he basically saves the life of Xavier, and then everything is kind of fixed after that. But there were so many great stories, so many alternate reality stories that went on with things like that. And don't forget the battle cry of Wolverine. So Wolverine couldn't kill people in X-Men the Animated Series. He had to kill robots. So he would tear the Sentinels to shreds. But the battle cry of Wolverine, every time Wolverine ran into battle, he'd pop his claws and he'd only ever say one of two things. Either he would just shout Gene, he would just be like, Gene! Or he would just be like, this one's for you, Morph. Everything was for Morph. Like Morph died 50 years beforehand. Like if Morph had died 50 years beforehand, Wolverine would just go running into battle. This one's for you, Morph. It's like, dude, Wolverine, like Morph died years ago. Like at the time, it was epic it was so epic. But now, looking back, it is kind of like, dude, like really? Like all of his attacks were named after Gene? Gene! Dude, I loved X-Men the Animated Series. Yeah, I would most certainly say X-Men the Animated Series definitely holds up. I mean, not even because I'm biased towards it, but just because when I go back and I look at that, to me, a hallmark of a show is that it's just as good 10 years after you first saw it as it was when you first saw it. That feeling of excitement, that feeling of, man, dude, I can't wait to see what happens next. That feeling remains. Whether you've seen it 1,000 times, whether you've seen it 10,000 times, that excitement, that interest, that passion for that show is always there. To me, that's a defining hallmark of what makes those shows great. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos like this, then make sure you drop a like. Let me know down in the comments section what you guys think about X-Men the Animated Series. I'm sure a lot of you guys will post comments anyway, but let me know whether or not you liked it. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.
Sweet, sweet